Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
China says allegations by Philippine Defense Secretary are unfounded. Why is Teodoro so determined to push China and the Philippines toward confrontation? South Korean president to revive pro-Japanese asset investigation committee after 16 years. Can normal relations with neighbors be maintained if Japan still refuses to confront its wartime history? And the world's largest drone maker, China's DJI, scores a key procedural victory in lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Defense. Hello and welcome to Road Today. I'm Geanna in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching Road Today. Our top story, China has rejected renewed allegations by Philippine Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro concerning Chinese workers detained at a steel plant in Mindanao 3 months ago. The Chinese embassy in the Philippines said prosecutors found insufficient evidence against the 70 Chinese nationals and ordered their release later in May. The embassy questioned Teodoro's continued accusations and rejected claims of interference in Philippine law enforcement, saying he has a responsibility to protect the legitimate interests of Chinese citizens. China has also urged the Philippine side to respect the rule of law and oppose discriminatory or selective law enforcement targeting Chinese nationals. So for more on this, joining us on the line is Einar Tangen, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, a Canadian think tank. Thanks for joining us, Einar.
Pleasure.
Let's start with the steel plant incident in May. Teodoro personally sent in the military to arrest 70 unarmed Chinese workers. The Philippine justice authorities later said there wasn't enough evidence to support the charges, but these workers still spent 32 days in detention before being released. And later, Chinese embassy released 7 questions fundamentally rejected the allegation. So what details stand out to you and what makes this look like more than a routine law enforcement operation?
Well, it cannot be construed as routine when the Minister of Defense orders it. It doesn't have any evidence, only detains the Chinese workers, then has them dress up in some sort of odd gear to make it look like they had been doing something. They were detained. They were not allowed to see the consular officials, contrary to the international agreements. This was, in essence, a political play by somebody who was trying to test the waters to see whether he can be a presidential candidate. He has not declared, but it is strongly felt that he will be doing that. Clearly, this was a play that was aimed at pleasing Washington and, in his mind, getting support from Washington for his potential candidacy.
Could you elaborate more on Teodoro and his relationship with Washington? Because clearly this isn't just about the steel plant incident. Teodoro has been increasingly active in pushing anti-China rhetoric and initiatives. A lot of commentary, like you pointed out, portrays him as a typical figure in the Philippines pro-U.S. political establishment. And some have even called him a U.S.-backed proxy, right?
Well, it's obviously very close. I mean, he's the one who's been pushing for all these bases and missiles and things like that. He's clearly in the U.S. camp. In 2020, he has been listed by China as somebody who is anti-Chinese. So there's no basis for him to go forward and say that, yeah, he wants to work with China. He's clearly on the opposite side, and he clearly believes that the U.S. is going to determine the outcome of the Philippines election. I would disagree with him because he has very serious contenders, especially in terms of Sarah Duterte, who was once working with Marcos and is now definitely in the other camp. So this is typical of Philippine elections. It's all about trying to create headlines, be salacious, create details that are not there. It doesn't matter what the truth is. It's simply which side you're trying to push. And obviously, all of this stuff is, as I said, testing the waters to see whether Washington would back his candidacy and who else on the opposition side. Remember, Marcos is not named anybody in terms of his successor, and it's doubtful that he will name his sister after she accused him of being a drug taker.
So, when the justice system in the Philippines has already said that there isn't enough evidence, but the defense minister keeps pushing the opposite narrative, what does this tell us about the political divisions inside the Philippines?
So this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is political theater. It has nothing to do with justice. That defense minister ordering the arrest of people in a steel plant. This is for the police. This was clearly him trying to attract attention. So, discussing the merits of it makes no sense because there are no merits. Even the Filipino justice system has said clearly that there was never any evidence, that would have justified this arrest. And the fact that it would use the military to do it, this is completely unheard of. And as I said, it's just the kind of political stunt that makes headlines in the Philippines, makes him look like he's Washington's guy, and he's hoping that people will go along with it. But right now, Washington isn't the guy. Donald Trump is certainly not helping the Philippines. He's put tariffs on them just like he has everybody else.
Teodoro is deliberately pushing the Philippines toward confrontation with China. What does that mean for China-Philippine ties? And more importantly, what does it mean for ordinary Filipinos?
So let's start with the Filipino people. This is directly against everything that they need economically. China and the Philippines are tied together because there's so many inputs that come from China, whether it's cloth or rubber or electronic equipment that goes into things that are assembled in the Philippines or added value in the Philippines and then go to other markets, especially the U.S. But, as I said, the U.S. has not been a friend to the Philippines. They've been subject to the same tariffs and et cetera as the rest of the world. So what does it mean between China and the Philippines? Well, I think China is taking a longer view. They're not going to blame the entire Filipino people for the actions of somebody who's trying to curry the favor of Washington. So hopefully they'll see that in the long run, the politics of the Philippines are going to follow the economics, and the economics are clearly to have better relations with China, not worse. They might feel that they need some sort of security arrangement in Washington, but what this guy is doing has nothing to do with security. He's actually making the situation worse by, as you pointed out, precipitating some sort of action. We've all seen what has been happening in the islands of South China Seas with these patrol boats from the Philippines initiating action against Chinese Coast Guard entities there. And because China has taken a firmer line on these areas, I think this is his way of trying to send a message that he's the strong man who will protect Washington's interests, not Philippines' interests.
Mm-hmm. I know one last question, because recently we see Philippine President Marcos has said publicly that he wants to improve relations with China, but at the same time we keep seeing individual politicians creating new tensions. So what should both sides learn from the steel plant incident? And how can China and the Philippines make sure that the political theater of a few politicians doesn't end up hijacking the entire relationship?
Well, the last question first. You have to have patience. And we're at a particularly very volatile time because of the economic consequences of what Washington is pursuing. It's creating a global slowdown. It's possible that we might have a global shock if, for some reason, the American AI model does not work out and you have a lot of people losing money. It could be a chain reaction that is not good. So you're going to see increasing volatility, especially in these countries. That's the patience part. But China has to take a larger view. As I said, these things, you cannot judge them in the moment. Filipino people, if you go there, they're friendly, they're nice. They're also interested in the same thing as the Chinese people, and that is a better governance system, better infrastructure, better opportunities. This is a country that has a lot of potential, but it also has a large population, which is being underserved.
Thank you for your insightful analysis. That was Einar Tangen, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, a Canadian think tank. This is World Today. Stay tuned. South Korea is set to revive the pro-Japanese asset investigation committee after a 16-year pause. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung says his government will investigate and recover assets illicitly amassed by pro-Japanese anti-national collaborators during Japan's colonial rule and hold them fully accountable before history. He made the remarks in an address to mark the 81st anniversary of the Korean Peninsula's liberation from the 1910 to 1945 Japanese colonial rule. Under the Special Act, recovered funds and liquidated proceeds will be prioritized for the welfare, livelihood, and honorary support projects for the Korean independence activists and their surviving family. For more on this, my colleague Do Hongyu talked with Dr. Liu Kuangyu, researcher at Institute of Taiwan Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences.
Dr. Liu, South Korea is restarting the pro-Japanese asset investigation after 16 years of hiatus. So why now? How would you read its timing and major purpose?
I don't think the decision to reactivate the committee is only read as a single policy, but I think it's more like a convergence of three calendars. First, is the historical calendar of August 15, and also the legislative calendar of newly seated government, and also as well as the geopolitical calendar of a rapidly hardening regional order. We see from legally, the ground was laid months ago, actually. South Korea's National Assembly passed a revised special act on this national vesting of properties of pro-Japanese and anti-national actors in this May, and it will take effect in December. And President Lee chose the 81st Liberation Day ceremony to announce this implementation. I think he's deliberately fusing the moral authority of the state with the instrumental force to the statute. And also the new committee receives a 5-year mandate, 1 year longer than its predecessor. And I think this closes the loophole that allowed descendants to lauder assets by selling them to third parties, and also proceeds from such disposals as now themselves recoverable. And whistleblower were a mechanism also we see has been added. And also, if we look at their purpose, I think is threefold as well. And the first, restorative justice. They're trying to take justice back, to recover funds, not for general revenue. I think this more for the welfare and honorary support for independence activities and their surviving families, which I think is symbolic rebalancing of moral ledger and is favor collaborators for Japan in the 8 years. And also, secondly, institutional completion. The first committee back in 2006 to 2010 was truncated by a 4-year sunset clause and was dissolved with a vast majority of cases unresolved. And so this is more like makeup. And the third thing is that this is more sharply thing. It's a signal to Tokyo. I think on the very day the Seoul announced this investigation, we see the Japan defense minister as well as a lot of DPP high-rank officials visit Yasukuni, and also the prime minister sent ritual offerings. So this timing is not coincidental. I think it's a deliberate counter-narrative.
The first investigation only identified about a quarter of collaborators designated by the Center for Historical Truth and Justice, which is a historical research NGO. So what are the main obstacles facing the work? Why is it that difficult?
The first obstacle, I think, was statutory. The original act imposed a 4-year expiration date, and asset tracing across 7 decades is inherently and inevitably slow. So the clock ran out just as the committee was developing a real methodology. Second, I think, was asset flight or the loss of asset. During the 16-year hiatus after 2010, descendants systematically sold, transferred, subdivided, or retitled their properties, often to ostensibly independent third parties. So this will place them beyond the reach of law and could only recover assets still being held in collaborators' name. And one last obstacle was the most political and least discussed. We see the collaborators were not a marginal fringe. They become the ruling class somehow in Korean politics and society right now. We see the 2005 Truth Commission's list of more than 3,000 anti-national actors, including former President Park Chung-hee. And after 1945, the U.S. military government retained colonial-era administrators and also police and also business elites to administer the southern zone. So these families then dominate the post-war state for a very long time, and their military dictatorship also was built up on that as well. So investigating on their assets means investigating more like somehow the foundations of South Korea's own post-liberal power structure.
And on the same day of South Korea's announcement of the investigation committee, Japanese Defense Minister Shinjiro Koizumi visited the Yasukuni Shrine that honors convicted Class A Japanese war criminals from World War II. And Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi performed a remote act of worship toward it. So what message is Japan trying to send by the visits to the shrine by the officials?
Yeah, that was a very huge roster to visit this shrine, so-called shrine. I think the domestic message is unambiguous. The LDP's conservative base regards Yasukuni as the symbolic antithesis of the Tokyo Tribunal narrative. So visiting this so-called shrine signals the rejection of the visitor's justice, framing and reaffirms the revisionist position that Japan's war dead, including the 14 enshrined Class A war, not criminals, but like martyrs or saint men who has sacrificed for themselves, for the nation. And for Takaichi, who has built her career in this constituency, and the offering is a down payment on this ideological compact that brought her to power. So for Koizumi, the defense minister, who has visited annually since 2010 across multiple cabinet portfolios, I think his personal grant was like political statement that will build his rank in the hierarchy. This regional message, I think, is equally deliberate and more consequential. And we see a defense minister visiting Yasukuni on the defeat anniversaries is not a private cultural act. It's a signal about how the defense and how the government establishment understand the past and will pursue the future. When the minister is responsible for military undergoing this most significant expansion issue, 1945 honors Class A war criminals. We see the neighborhood countries like China, South Korea, and Russia rated as an indication that institutional memory of the self-defense forces is being aligned with revisionist worldview, and this collective LDP leadership visit will further normalize the practice. What was once provocative individual gesture becomes, for now, and maybe later, in like institutional party culture or party collective behavior.
And then what do these widespread misgivings from South Korea, China, tell us about regional risks from Japan's military direction?
We neighboring countries have all good reasons to concern because the empirical basis for this concern is solid, concrete. Japan's financial year 2026 defense budget now reached more than 9 trillion yen, which is its 14th consecutive annual increase, and roughly 2% of their GDP, and will rough into something like 3% of GDP very, very soon. So this will achieve a target originally set for like maybe the year later, 2 years early. And also we see the 2027 budget request more than 10 trillion yen. The risk is not that Japan will spontaneously revert to military right this day, or the new militarism. I think the risk more lies something more like more subtle and more dangerous. We know a country, Japan still has not reconciled with its wartime past. And now they're acquiring the capability to project power beyond its borders and the power to frame its neighbors as so-called existential threats to Japan itself, which is very clearly, obviously, an execute. And historical revisionism provides this ideological substrate. And also they use the Taiwan contingency and survival crisis situations and crises to provide their something like operational doctrine, and defense budget provides this hardware. So you can see the system of reviving or new militarism reborn. So when all these 3, 4, 5 elements converge, I think this threshold for miscalculation may drop.
And then given these actions by Japan that you have just mentioned, how credible is Japan's call for peace when it simultaneously frames its neighbors as security threats?
Yeah, we see Japan as its neighbors countries to set the peaceful intentions while systematically dismantling the evidentiary and institutional basis on which those intentions can be verified, actually. If we check the record, Japan's never issued a formal, state-level, thorough apology for its wartime aggression endorsed by the Diet. Although they have this Murayama statement in 1995, it was a cabinet declaration and it's not legislative resolution. And now the subsequent prime ministers, most notably like Shinzo Abe and also Takaichi, they have diluted or qualified its language. They abandoned that statement right now. We know that Takaichi has been questioning Murayama himself when Takaichi was a congresswoman for this statement. So if we look at the school textbooks, they're trying to erase or marginalize references, for example, to the Nanjing Massacre and to the comfort women system and forced labor as well. So if you look at or ask a younger generation in Japan, or maybe those kids tomorrow, they don't know what happened in the past. So how can you expect that the future generations will regret and doing the rightful things in the future? All these things are very, very dangerous signals. And against this backdrop, Japan simultaneously constructs its neighbors, we know, at the same time as security threats, especially China and Korea, North Korea, and calls for a so-called free and open Indo-Pacific route in the rule of law and so on, etc. That's their narrative. So the contradiction is not lost on this region. We see the defense minister still honors their Class A war criminals. I don't think this is a country can be credible when presenting this military expansion as purely defensive.
That was Dr. Liu Kuangyu, researcher at the Institute of Taiwan Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, speaking with Dou Hongyu. More to come. China briefs media on first 7 months of economic performance. This is World Today. We'll be back.
Welcome. I'm Elaf Elad, economics professor and member of the Data Science and AI Center at New York University, Shanghai. On the World Today program, you can find in-depth and impartial insight, as well as critical commentary on key trends in the Chinese economy, financial technology, business, and blockchain. To prepare for the world tomorrow, join me on World Today.
Whether it's about your education, the home you live in, or the items you buy, your money has a story to tell. Because every business story is a human story. Global Business.
Hello, my name is Alessandro Golombieski Teixeira. I'm a professor of public policy and management at Tsinghua University in Beijing. I am a great listener of The World Today. In my opinion, The World Today is one of the best China radio programs. In The World Today, we can get the best news and analysis in what is happening now in the world. So please come to join us.
Welcome back to World Today with me, Anna, in Beijing. The output of China's industrial robots increased by more than a quarter in the first 7 months of the year. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, the national economy maintained overall stability in the January-July period, with a trend toward new growth drivers and improved quality. Industrial value added of surveyed enterprises was up by 5.3%. The production index of the services sector was 4.7% higher. Foreign trading goods expanded by 17.3%. To delve into this, let's have Professor Liu Baocheng, Director of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Thank you for the invitation.
Professor, the latest economic data for the 7 months of the year have been released. How would you describe the economy right now, and what really supporting this steady growth?
Well, I would characterize Chinese economy as generally resilient, but structurally uneven. So it is neither a broad-based boom nor a decline. The production side remains relatively strong, particularly for the advanced manufacturing, introduction of the digital technologies in those industries. And then the modern services are strong, where exports are outstandingly performing. So we still notice that the domestic demand, investment are really weak. So therefore, the main support comes from the industrial upgrading, technology investment, export competitiveness, and the expansion of modern services. So the general picture looks rather positive, but I would still the stretch type of imbalance, because fixed investment, they fell by 6.7%, and the private investment also fell by nearly 10%. So the real estate remains rather lackluster. So that tells us that we need to keep the resilience in the general performance of the economy, but also we need to improve the overall supply side competitiveness, particularly to stimulate the domestic demand.
Then from January to July, we see industrial output at major industrial enterprises grew by 5.3%, while the services production index rose 4.7%. Both major areas of production maintained steady growth. What do these figures tell us about the resilience of the industrial side of the economy and the ongoing structural upgrading?
I think that's a very good question, because most important message is not only simply the growth of the production capacity, but it is how the growth is being managed and where it does really come from. Therefore, where the industrial output grow by 5.3%, the high-tech manufacture grows by 13.8%, and the output of 3D printing equipments, new energy batteries, and industrial robots rose even far more aggressively, on the average of 40%, respectively. And also on the service side, information technology helped really to boost the service by over 10%, and leasing business services also on that level. So that indicates a general structural shift. So when China is moving from a growth model dominated by the conventional type of manufacturing and a physical investment, now we are really moving with a larger contribution from advanced equipments, digital technologies, automation, and knowledge-intensive services.
Mm-hmm. Earlier you mentioned the consumption. The consumption data this time are especially interesting. Overall consumption grew by 2.6%, with services consumption up 5%, while goods consumption increased by just 1.1%. Services consumption is clearly outpacing spending on physical goods. Why is that, and what does this tell us about how people's spending habits are changing today?
One very important measure for the living quality of the people is the Engels coefficient, to measure what proportion is being spent on the total income for basic living like food and clothing, etc. So this shows the livelihood of the Chinese people are getting more positive, because the living standard is there to rise and more of the expenditures take place on the necessities like services, including travel, entertainment, communication, health building, education, and other type of lifestyle-related activities. So in the same time, the goods consumption grows only marginally about 1%. That partly shows that the maturity of many durable goods markets are there to dominate the sales picture. That also shows a sort of weakness in those large ticket items like the properties and also cars, etc. So that really is there to remain cautious for a general household to spend on those discretionary purchases where expectation about income, employment, asset value needs to be given further confidence by policy and also by market performance. So this divergence therefore tells us that consumption is becoming more service-oriented, but the weakness in goods demand suggests that on one hand, the living standard is on the rise, but that also shows that household confidence needs to be fully recovered.
Professor, let's talk about two things people care about most, jobs and prices. The urban unemployment rate stayed at around 5.2% from January to July, while consumer prices rose just 0.9%. How should we read these numbers?
Well, over the past few months and relating to last year, the figure is rather stable in terms of the unemployment rate. And there is a certain rise in July by 0.2%. That also has a seasonal type of impact because of the large amount of, well over 1 million graduates are really joining the job market from universities. So now in terms of the inflation, that also requires a more balanced interpretation. So China's goal is really to manage a roughly 2% of the inflation rate. Now, with less than 1%, that does not really show a sort of a deflation, but on one hand, it shows a stable price for general consumers. It also shows that discretionary considerations from the household side. But on a macro level, it gives the monetary policy more room to be able to boost liquidity and also investment. So right now, the CPI measure is there to give people more confidence, but it also shows more of the macro policy adjustment is needed to be able to feed more momentum in the investment side. And more importantly, the supply side reform is also there to be able to be spurred to produce more of the goods that are really needed and preferred by the consumption patterns.
Mm-hmm. Professor, one last question. Based on the overall performance of the economy for the first 7 months, where should the policy focus its efforts in the coming months of the year? And how can policymakers further consolidate the positive momentum while offsetting the existing pressures?
First, demand needs to be further strengthened with more confidence restored on the consumer side rather than further boosting the production capacity. Of course, more of the support is still needed to grow the Chinese high-tech manufacture. Therefore, export that related with more of the outbound investment need to be further harnessed instead of simply gauging in a large volume export. And based on that, so second consideration is how policy can be there to give confidence to the private sector in terms of their investment and business operation. And so when the government is there to boost the jobs, so the private sectors are really the largest provider of those job opportunities, and that can also give people more predictable expectation as how much income they can earn so that they are able to unleash their spending power. And third, if the property sector still needs stabilization, if not a boost, because people still need to improve their living conditions, and that can also have a a stronger effect on many other sectors. So finally, I think we should continue to invest in the technology upgrading and more importantly to spread its impact into more of the traditional industries instead of creating a spike in these entire industrial structures.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Professor, for those valuable insights. That was Professor Liu Baocheng, Director of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. This is World Today. We'll be back. The world's largest drone maker, China's DJI, has reportedly scored a key procedural victory in its long-running legal battle with the U.S. Department of Defense. A U.S. federal appeals court has ordered a lower court to reconsider the legality of the Pentagon's decision to place DJI on a blacklist of companies allegedly linked to China's military. DJI was first placed on the blacklist in October 2022. The company has repeatedly rejected the designation and challenged its inclusion. After those efforts failed, DJI sued the U.S. Defense Department in late 2024. The lower court later ruled in favor of the department. DJI appealed, leading to the latest ruling. So for more on this, let's bring in Bai Xianyue, partner of Grandel law firm Tianjin office. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Bai.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
The U.S. Court of Appeals has sent DJI's case back to the lower courts for reconsideration, which has been described as a key procedural victory for DJI. So what exactly did the appeals court reject or call into question about the U.S. Department of Defense's case at this legal level?
A three-judge panel of U.S. Court of Appeals for the District Columbia Circuit found no publicly stated rationale explaining why the Defense Department concluded that DJI contributes to China defense industrial base. The appeal court basically said there's no publicly stated rationale for why the Secretary believes, that is Secretary of Defense, believes DJI contributes to the Chinese defense industrial base. The idea really is that the lower court made a mistake, erred by relying only on the unclassified record, including that the company contributes to Chinese defense industry. So that is basically the, I think the point, or where the Court of Appeal find the lower court made a mistake.
Under the U.S. administrative litigation process, what are the key steps the court will take after this case is sent back, and what legal hurdles does DJI still have to clear before it can ultimately be removed from blacklist?
The appellate court will send back the mandate back to the district court for the District of Columbia, and the lower court, that is the district court, then will reopen proceedings and set a new struggling order. The district court will also examine the previously unexamined classified materials and secret rationale provided by the Department of Defense. The judge will then probably permit DJI and the government to submit focused supplemental legal briefs addressing the specific classified rationale. And in the meantime, the court will issue a fresh decision determining whether the Secretary of Defense listing is arbitrary and capricious under the Administrative Procedure Act when factoring the classified evidence. Well, there will definitely be some legal hurdles for removal, which will be favorable to DJI, hopefully. Overcoming national security defense is not always easy. It's quite challenging, as a matter of fact. The U.S. court heavily favor executive agencies in matters of military and foreign intelligence designation. So this makes it very difficult to overturn a defense-related label. DJI must legally dismantle the argument that its dual-use technology or status at National Tech Center legally translates into supporting the Chinese defense industrial base. Because this a drone that can be used for both civilian purposes and military purposes. This is something that DJI has to clarify and make explanation. In the meantime, even if DJI beats the Pentagon designation, it faces separate active legal and regulatory hurdles, such as restrictions and equipment bans via the Federal Communication Commission covered list. So DJI definitely has a uphill battle to fight.
We know the U.S. has continued to expand the scope of what it defines as national security, imposing restrictions on Chinese technology companies in areas like semiconductors, AI, and drones. What makes DJI's case unique, and could this procedural ruling provide a useful legal reference for other Chinese companies challenging similar blacklisted designations?
Well, this is a very interesting question. This case is different in several ways, I would say. First of all, DJI is primarily a consumer and a commercial civil technology giant, unlike semiconductor or telecom firms like Huawei, for example, not directly tied to critical infrastructure or state-backed heavy technology. The appeals court explicitly noted there was no publicly stated rationale explaining why Defense Department believes DJI contributes to the defense industrial base. So in terms of evidence, so far, DJI has made a point, but of course, unlike many other firms that accept a designation or exit the US market simply, DJI chose to instigate a multi-year federal lawsuit challenging the precise statutory definition used by the Pentagon under Section 1260H. In terms of the legal references for other Chinese companies, I guess the current ruling appears to have favored DJI, basically forcing lower court to look closely at whether government agencies actually substantiate national security claims rather than granting rubber stamp summary judgment. But it's much more complicated than that. The case does provide a template for other blacklisted entities, such as Alibaba or biotech firms facing similar bans, to challenge list first and evidence later bureaucratic sort of a decision due to insufficient public administrative records. In this sense, it does provide a reference for other Chinese companies. But we have to note that because the appellate court, that is the Court of Appeal, did not strike down DJI's listing outright. So that is not the end of the story. Instead, the Court of Appeal instructed the lower court to further inspect classified materials. So in that sense, it remains a procedural hurdle rather than a permanent legal shield.
Then from U.S. perspective, after several years of legal challenges, does this case raise a broader question about the due process behind the U.S. government's use of national security as basis for, restricting Chinese companies today?
Well, a short answer is yes. Legal challenge by DJI and other targeted technology Chinese firms highlighted a tense debate over transparency, due process, administrative overreach, and the standard of proof the U.S. government must provide when invoking national security to restrict foreign enterprises. Recent appellate rulings, such as the DC, that is the District of Columbia Circuit, directing a lower court to re-examine the Pentagon's backlisting of DJI, emphasize that public unclassified records often lack a clear, concrete rationale or direct evidence showing how a civilian tech firm materially supports a foreign military. This due use threshold that applies to DJI, that is, as I said before, both for civilian use and for could potentially be used for military purposes, This has raised some arguments and some debate. There are critics and corporate legal teams who argue that labeling any commercial technology with broad dual-use capabilities as a military threat effectively nullifies corporate anti-war policies and sets a very vague precedent. Regarding the least first evidence later bureaucratic sort of a practice, industry analysts and affected companies contend that preventative administrative backlisting create opaque regulatory environment, forcing firms into protracted litigation to prove a negative regarding state control. So in this sense, there are references for Chinese companies to later on of other companies, I would say, to refer to something that would be useful, I guess, in their future battle if there's any in similar circumstances.
Thanks for those insightful explanation. That was by Shen Yue, partner of Grandal Law Firm Tianjin office. German companies have cut direct investment in the United States to a 3-year low amid uncertainty over U.S. trade policies. According to the German Economic Institute, in the first half of this year, German direct investment in the U.S. fell nearly 2/3 from a year earlier to about $5 billion. That was nearly 80% lower than in the same period of 2024. German firms already operating in the U.S. continue to reinvest profits locally, but remain cautious about committing fresh capital. For more on this, Lan Qingxuan spoke with Dr. Li Lun, assistant professor of economics at Peking University.
German companies' investment in the U.S. has been declining in recent years. What policies from Washington are driving this trend?
Yeah, so we're seeing that there's a substantial decline, especially in the capital commitments from German companies into the US. I think a lot of policy uncertainty is definitely more important if we're also talking about the tariff rate. The companies, when they are entering or investing in a different country, they definitely calculate the cost of what the tariff is, but they also find it much harder if the policy changes every day. So there's a lot of policy uncertainty when it comes to tariff rates, exemptions, when it comes to the coverage and the rules. So the repeated change is causing a lot of trouble for a lot of the German investors and German companies. And also, not to mention that the cost of operating in the United States have also increased a lot. So when companies face tariffs, the imported components, the more documentation, more requirements, more regulatory compliance, this is adding a lot of administrative burden for these companies as well. So I do think there's also a lot of constraints from Germany as well, because German companies, they're also dealing with a lot of weak domestic growth, high energy cost, high labor cost in German as well. So I do think this is going to cause them to be more cautious when it comes to corporate investment budgets. It's not to say German companies are suddenly losing interest in the American market. I do think it's a combination of the policy unpredictability, high operating cost, and also weaker corporate balance sheets that combined to create this phenomenon.
Which sectors have seen the sharpest declines in investment by German companies in the U.S.?
Even though we're not seeing the detailed breakdown of the declining in foreign investment from Germany, I can offer some example or sectoral evidence from other sources of data. So first of all, the automotive industry from Germany appears to be under a lot of pressure. So German exports, for example, of vehicles and automotive parts to the United States fell by almost 14% in the first 9 months of 2025, especially making the industry vulnerable because the production is organized through this integrated system of North American and European supply chain. So if we're seeing a lot of pressure, for example, subject to tariffs, so every car assembled in the United States, they contain a lot of imported German parts. Those are going to create a lot of price surge and price pressure for the automotives sold in the United States. And also when it comes to mechanical engineering, industrial machinery, these are also heavily affected. So the German engineering exports to the United States fell by approximately 9% 5.5%. So there's also a lot of survey that almost 90% of mechanical engineering companies have reported a negative effect from the US trade policy. So when it comes to other sectors such as metals, chemicals, these groups are also very vulnerable because when it comes to basically these components or intermediate goods that's imported from Germany to the United States for domestic manufacturing, these high tariffs are going to affect these sectors where also investment decisions are heavily depending on these input costs as well. So I do think the pressure is definitely concentrated in manufacturing sectors with a lot of complex cross-border supply chains, with a lot of importing into the United States, and those sectors are especially vulnerable compared with other sectors.
The Trump administration had hoped that tariffs would encourage foreign companies to invest in the U.S., yet new investment by German companies has fallen sharply. So why have tariffs failed to produce the expected investment boost?
Yeah, so the theoretical logic behind this is very straightforward. When you have more import tariffs, imports are going to become more expensive, and foreign companies will have more incentive to actually build factories in America and sell in America directly. So this is sometimes called the tariff jumping investment, but it only works if the firms believe that the tariff is going to be stable, is going to be long lasting, the local production is more economically viable. So producing in the United States, it's not an easy process. It doesn't really eliminate all the tariff exposure or import needs. So for example, German manufacturers operating in America, they still need to import a lot of specialized machinery, a lot of intermediate inputs, a lot of components from Europe or elsewhere. So a local assembly line is going to become more expensive to operate because all of the imported inputs are subject to tariffs. And also tariff also reduce the local demand because a lot of exporters are passing tariff costs fully to American customers. So there's going to be less local demand from America of German products as well. And also in terms of other structural or operating costs, they are also very important. For example, a lot of German companies find that there's a shortage of skilled labor, also high labor cost, very high customs administration costs, and also uncertainty over the future policies. So these are also causing a lot of pressure to operate locally in the United States. And so overall, I think from a macroeconomic perspective, spending time or spending resource to localize the production may not be such an economically viable or profitable venture. So that kind of partially explains why the investment from Germany to America has not increased.
The EU-US trade deal included a commitment to $600 billion in new investment in the US by 2028. Why has this policy-level effort to provide greater certainty failed to translate into greater investment confidence among German companies?
Yeah, so first of all, the $600 billion investment, even though it's a good or expected investment program, it's not a legally enforceable program. So none of these $600 billion is actually going to be enforced under the European Commission or under the US government. So nobody can order Volkswagen or any other companies to undertake these commercially unattractive projects. So overall, I think the lack of legal binding partly explains why the agreement isn't effective, even though I think it provided greater predictability and also confidence for investors. But also when it comes to higher level of trade protection, the agreement also makes some sectors more vulnerable. So before the recent trade conflict, for example, the average US tariff on EU products was only approximately 1.2%. So the agreement established a ceiling of around 15% of many EU exports, but that's still more than 10 times higher before this trade conflict. So the higher predictability, even though provided some confidence to investors, but it's still a significantly higher level of tariffs. And also, I think a lot of important policy questions isn't really resolved from this agreement. So companies, they still have, for example, steel and aluminum duties, a lot of rules of origin requirements, possibly new demands with European regulators as well. So to make an investment decision is not as simple example, as when they see a new policy, the companies all rush to the United States and instantly fulfill all of the commitment. So the agreement definitely, I think it kind of reduced the risk of escalation of the trade conflict, but I don't think it really create a very binding obligation for the investment or eliminate all the concerns or uncertainties that's facing the European companies.
And what impact could the sharp decline in German investment have on the US?
Yeah, so I think there's several things that I would like to mention. So first of all, having fewer factories and fewer projects would definitely mean fewer local profits, fewer supplier orders, fewer jobs in the United States. So a slowdown in the expansion or in the construction of a lot of these projects is going to have meaningful effects, especially at the regional level. It could also weaken the US manufacturing as a whole because German companies, they're important suppliers for local industrial machinery, for local technology, for chemicals, specialized equipments, and so on and so forth. So if one German company fails to enter the US, there is going to create a ripple effects for a lot of downstream US producers and US manufacturers. So I think also there could be a signaling effect. So if even German companies are closely watching and delaying some of the investments, then what about companies from other European countries? So I think the main danger is also about this loss of confidence in the US investment as well.
That was Dr. Li Lun from Peking University speaking with my colleague Len Qinxuan. That's all the time for this edition of World Today with me, Anna. Until next time.